Hello and welcome to the Neurologic podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we will be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is Neurologic.
Welcome to today's episode where we discuss the adolescent brain with one of the leading voices in developmental neuroscience, Dr. Beatriz Luna, a distinguished professor from the University of Pittsburgh.
Dr. Luna has dedicated her career to understanding how the brain evolves during one of the most transformative periods of life.
In this conversation, we explore the science behind teenage impulsivity, risk-taking, and emotional intensity, and why these behaviors are not only normal, but essential.
Dr. Luna explains how hormonal and neurobiological changes during the teen years shape behavior and discusses the real-world impact of her research on mental health, addiction, and public policy.
So whether you're a parent, educator, policymaker, or just curious about the teenage brain, this episode will challenge assumptions and offer a fresh perspective on what it means to grow up. Let's get started.
So your journey from Chile to becoming a leading neuroscientist in the US is incredibly inspiring. What initially drew you to studying how the brain develops?
Well, this was something that really goes with the area that I'm interested in, which is adolescence. I was a high risk-taking adolescent, but besides, getting in trouble, I was absolutely fascinated with philosophy, with the meaning of mind, but also the biological aspect of it and how to link these together and how so many philosophers had that question. And, coming to the States as a teenager and starting to be exposed to the fact that there are ways to look at this was a very important aspect of the beginning of my trajectory.
Okay. So you've spoken before about balancing life as a scientist and as a mother. What have been some of the biggest challenges along that path?
The one thing, when I look back, I don't believe in regrets, but there is one thing. I used to literally, shed tears every time I left the house to go to SFN or go give a talk here or there. I'd get in the airplane, I'd be fine, blah, 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 and then I'd come back and the kids would have bonded a lot with my husband. I'm like, meh. But now they're in their 30s and I look back and I'm very, very close to them. And it's helped their motivation for their own career trajectories. And it was all good. So the only thing I would change is stop feeling bad about having to leave. They know you're coming back, and really make that time that you're together with them a very sincere and honest time.
To let go of the mommy guilt.
Exactly.
I love that, yeah. And it kind of teaches them that independence and finding their way. So you've described adolescence as a neurobiological critical period. Can you explain what that means and why is this stage such a pivotal time for brain development?
That's an excellent question, and it drives everything that I do. So I'll start with the second part of it. Why is adolescence so important? So overall, it is important because decisions about what your brain is going to look like based on very specific brain mechanisms that are only present in adolescence, are going to determine who you are as an adult and position you for aging. And we're talking about these links, predictive links and so forth. So that has become extremely important aspect of it. And still now talk about adolescence as a sensitive period, just saying, there's greater sensitivities to certain things like social processing, etc. But critical period plasticity is something that is very well understood neurobiologically. And the important aspect of it is that there is a specific window where you have to get specific sort of stimuli to really have an impact on neurobiology. And we've been looking at this, so it's no longer a sensitive period. It's critical period plasticity, and it follows many of the other critical periods that have occurred earlier in development. And it makes complete sense that adolescence, when you're fully grown, you can walk on your own, you don't have to be with mom and dad in school all the time and get your own experiences, that it is very unique because that is what you're going to need to mold your adult trajectory.
So when you're talking about those mechanisms are only present in adolescence, are you talking about the plasticity or is it something else?
Yeah, plasticity is going to be available for your whole lifespan. Different levels of plasticity. There are unique aspects of plasticity in adolescence that only will occur in adolescence. And what we have been finding is evidence, and others as well, of plasticity that is focused in prefrontal cortex.
And can you kind of define what you mean when you're talking about plasticity?
One example is what we know very well about visual cortical plasticity. You're born, you open your eyes, you get this influx of sensory information that increases excitation. I was explaining yesterday, I called it the go part of the brain with this neurotransmitter glutamate. And that breaks the balance with the stop signals, the inhibitory GABAergic neurochemical function. And the brain needs to be in balance to operate optimally. So when that is broken, so for example, you get all this light and you get all this excitation, that breaks it. And that is a trigger for that part of the brain to reorganize so it can adapt itself and be able to process this higher signal, complex information. And this is what we're seeing evidence of in executive function. If we've written a couple of very impactful review papers that denote what could be the possible triggers. Why is it in adolescence? And it all seems to fit perfectly, like beautifully designed development, that you would have this opportunity of critical period plasticity in adolescence after you've already accumulated all your basic abilities and during a time when reward processing is pushing you to go get new experiences, so that, okay, now that you can do that, let's open that level of plasticity so we can figure out what you as an individual are going to need to survive.
So at the biological level, we're talking about strengthening the connectivity between neurons based on what you're using at that time, versus maybe certain connectivity becomes weaker when you're not using that process. And so these are kind of the biological roots that we're talking about during this teenage years.
Yes, so that's very much what is happening. A lot of loss of connections, right? Because there's overproduction of connections so that you have this platform of which to get rid of what you don't need and become more efficient and optimal in your processing.
Yeah.
So it's really of an overabundance, and that's when we talk about synaptic pruning, which continues in prefrontal cortex later than other parts of the brain. The other one is the strengthening of connections structurally with myelination. And then there's a third one, which is the functional coupling of how two different parts of the brain interact. And we see a lot of evidence of dampening of the influence of emotion and reward regions to prefrontal as the cognitive reasoning part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, starts to predominate in adulthood.
So your driven dual systems model has gained a lot of attention. Could you walk us through its core ideas and how it helps explain why teens often take risks or act impulsively?
Maybe I'll start with a little example. So you have a little kid, he's walking with his mom, he's 7. He's like, oh, look, mommy, look at that rooftop. It'd be so fun to skateboard down it. And mom goes, no, you'd get hurt, Then you see a bunch of teenagers like, hey, dude, look at that roof. Let's go and do that. All right, call Johnny and call Mary. And they do a whole plan, and we'll get a ladder and we'll put it on YouTube or TikTok and blah, blah. So there's a very big difference, and I think the way that we've been perceiving and other models perceive it is, adolescents, they don't have access to adult level reasoning. They actually do. But it's being driven, that's why the word driven by this hypersensitivity to rewards and emotion, which is needed for that push to go get that novel experience that is needed to sculpt the brain. So that's what makes it very unique, our model. It's saying, you know what, there is availability. Not all the time, right? There's still a lot of refinement that needs to happen in prefrontal cortex and so forth. But if you're in a one-on-one with an adolescent, so for example, I've had conversations with adolescent health workers that, after hearing my talk, have changed their approach. For example, with teenagers with diabetes, where, they're like, okay, they're teenagers, they're not going to take care of themselves because they just don't have the capability. But then they're like, you told us they did. So now we talk to them directly and they're like, yeah, I can take care of this. And the care is way better because you have, tapped into this resource that, given a perfect situation, without distractions, without peers, you can access that part of it. And, it has implications for juvenile justice, it has implications for education and many other aspects, healthcare choices, etc.
So I think what you're saying is the fact that teens often get labeled as impulsive or reckless is maybe an unfair label, or would you say it is fair, but there's a reason for it?
I think that's a better. I really try to send the message that it is normative for adolescence to be a period of impulsivity and risk-taking. But another way to look at it, it's really about exploration and information seeking. Not all teenagers are going to be doing crazy things that could, risk their own survival. A lot of them are going to be like, oh, I like sci-fi, or, wow, history is interesting, or I want to start doing art. It's really a period of exploration. And I think what we can do is support as safe as an environment as can be possible, because they will be doing risk-taking. And the other thing that I often say, and this is more of an opinion, or based on my own parenting, is make sure that your kids, that your teens know that no matter what they do, they can always have your support in a non-judgmental way, which is not always the case. And teens are like, oh, no, I don't want my parents to know. And then they're suffering through pieces where you can be like, you know what? I don't care what you did. I will help you through, because this is a stage that will end, and I can be your support. Even if they don't want to listen to you. You talk anyways. Yeah.
That's a really refreshing perspective.
So are the changes happening in the brain different from the younger teen years to older teen years?
I mean, those are the sorts of things that we're trying to understand. There are many aspects that we really want to be able to make connections to. So, for example, what really defines adolescence is puberty. And puberty has several different stages. And there are different hormones that are involved. You're a male and you're a female and so forth. And that will have different implications from early to later adolescence. And we still have to characterize this a lot better. But I think that question is a good one, that there will be important differences when you're starting that period of refinement and exploration to what is demarcating that switch into adulthood. And I have some ideas of what can trigger that, if you're interested.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and this is also my interpretation of what could be happening. And I really think it is the demand for responsibilities. So when you start having kids, and when you have to pay rent, or like I always say, when you start paying for your own cell phone bill, which I think is perpetuating forever with these family plans. But it's, at some point the brain says, you know what? We're done with exploration. These resources are now needed to be really focused on planning, right? How am I going to feed my family? And how am I going to keep a job? And that might be the triggers that say, okay, enough with this. And, that has implications of other sorts of discussions about how in Western societies we have a prolonged period of adolescence. I mean, adolescence was something that
I was going to say, because even
Yeah.
like 100 years ago, I don't think adolescence was a thing. It's like you were a kid and then an adult, and people literally got married at 13 and began their adult lives, right? So.
And I remember thinking about that. I gave a talk at UNICEF many years ago. And somebody came to me and said, I work in, I forget where, some country in Africa where girls get married at 9. And they're having kids at 10 or 11. And it dawned on me, oh my God, adolescence is a luxury. The longer you have to specialize, the longer that you have that environmental influence and the ability to adapt. And, and people say maybe that's the reason why everyone's getting married later and having kids later and, deciding what is the career that they want to do. I often think, graduate school and med school is another sort of prolonging that period of specialization. So there are many variables that go into that. And it's not a bad thing, because a lot of people are like, these spoiled kids, the parents helicopter raise them and they have too much time. But there are a lot of benefits to protecting that time to specialize.
So that interaction with the environment is really important in determining this kind of impulsive or reckless behavior when we talk about teens. The environment does play a large role in that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most important things are the influence of peers, right? So, for example, when I've informed the U.S. Supreme Court on life without parole in juveniles, which has been overturned and so forth, you realize that most of the crimes are occurring in the presence of peers. It's not isolated as you see in adults. So environment plays a very, very important role. The thing when it comes to crime, for example, if I can expand on that, is the fact that it's difficult to understand if what the behaviors that you're seeing during that period of high risk taking is reflecting the foundational aspect of who that person is going to be, or if they're going to change as an adult. And I've been asked this, many times, and it's really when you're an adult and you're able to reflect back and say, oh my God, what I was doing was crazy, and I would never do that again, versus those who have not changed.
So dopamine, a neurotransmitter, is known to be involved in motivation and reward processing. How do changes in the dopamine system during adolescence influence behavior, particularly in terms when we're talking about the sensation seeking and decision making of teens?
Yeah, that's something that we've become very fascinated with. And so overall, people in the field may sometimes say, hey, dopamine, it's overactive during the adolescent period. And yes, there are aspects of this neurochemical that definitely show overactivity. But it's a very complex system. For example, there's how much dopamine you have and how many receptors there are to catch that dopamine. And that has different developmental trajectories that might be affecting behavior differently. And some of our latest findings, so we have a paper under review in Nature Communications, where counter to what people would think, it is those with the least amount of dopamine availability that are the ones who are who have increased risk taking. For example, substance use. We even started to find it in delinquency. Other people are finding the same thing. You're like, how is that possible? And it could be a compensatory mechanism, right? So some of the things that, for example, that we have found is, and others, is that the how much dopamine you have increases, especially in the reward area, and then it'll stabilize. And then the receptors, how much they can catch, are decreasing. So how do you get that system going? You need a really good match of how much dopamine you have with how many receptors. And when you're younger, if you don't have a lot of dopamine, you still have all these receptors, you're not going to get that system going. And, risk-taking might be bringing that additional, reward-related process to get the system going. So that's one way to think about it.
So producing more dopamine in order for the receptors to kind of catch that dopamine.
Yeah.
So teens have adult-level executive functions and decision-making abilities, as you mentioned before, but they're more influenced by their peers. And then also, as we just mentioned, like by reward and emotion. So how can parents and teachers or society help to guide them towards making better choices?
That is a very good question. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, do we really want them to only be making better choices all the time?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much to be learned from these
mistakes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this is a really good time to be able to learn that and for the brain to understand what works and doesn't work. You know, one of the biggest developmental changes that we have found is the recruitment of a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which does performance monitoring and is very aware of errors. And whenever there's an error, it says, okay, get the cognitive systems going so we don't produce this error again. And how do you know how to use this region if you don't have that? Now, what can you do with that sort of information? There's so many aspects that can be valuable when trying to support teenagers through this, what I think is a beautiful and very cool aspect of the lifespan, but, you know, it can be risky and so forth, is understanding certain things. You know, they're very reward driven. Heroes are very important to them. And if you know that, and to be forgiving, that, you know, yes, they will make poor decisions, and that's okay. And then they will make correct decisions. And if you have one-on-one conversations with them, that they have the capability of accessing this cognition. It's not reliable, and it's very variable by nature, which we want it to be. But, you know, I think a lot of tolerance and a lot of understanding that this is a very short period, that is really crucial.
And realizing that those mistakes that they're making is actually at the end of the day profiting them and helping to kind of advance their cognition as they're growing.
Exactly. If it doesn't kill them or
exactly.
injure them, right?
Yeah, there's a fine line.
Yeah, so there's that.
You don't want the
whole
mistakes
aspect
to be like lifelong consequence type
exactly.
of thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
So like you were saying, they perform at adult-like levels in tasks. You know, they can perform at adult-like levels, but there's different brain systems that are active than what we see in adults. So does that mean they have to work harder to perform like adults?
Yes. And as I've presented before, what we have found is that in the presence of rewards, the brain is willing to go to the extra mile to get that reward. That's what I was saying, that's a little bit of a key information for educators and parents to know, that, you know, rewards do have a neurobiological mechanism that can push even when it's something that is difficult for them to do. So motivation becomes very, very important.
So the prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that's involved in decision making. We kind of touched on that a little bit, as well as self-control. And some listeners may have heard that it's the last region of the brain to reach maturity. So it doesn't typically finish completion until maybe mid-20s or even later. So how does that impact teen behavior? And at what points can teens truly think like adults?
Prefrontal cortex does have a prolonged trajectory. That said, it's also the area that is more predominantly studied. So it's quite possible that other areas like parietal cortex that have to do with attention and temporal areas that have to do with language and memory might also have a protracted trajectory. So that's one thing. But when we stick with prefrontal cortex, what we have seen both in behavior and in very important aspects of neurobiological maturation of the prefrontal cortex is that it's not a linear function, right? So, and that's what the driven dual systems proposes. So you have accelerated maturation and development through childhood. And then very important, in adolescence, there's a slowdown. There's a deceleration as you start to make the turn towards being stable in adulthood, right? And we have found in a very big data behavioral study where we put together more than 4 different cohorts, looking at cognition in different ways, that this is really the shape of development, and that surprisingly enough, around 18 years of age, on average, you start to see that stabilization begin. And it's interesting because the majority of societies are putting 18 as the age, but there's so much variability. Some will be earlier, many will be later.
Yeah, I think that variability is very important to touch on. When we're talking about it, the prefrontal cortex reaching maturity at 25 or older, that's on average. But within an individual, that can change a lot.
Yeah, and if I can make a statement about that, because a lot of health decisions have come into the discussion, especially when the interpretation is, hey, look, prefrontal cortex is not adult-like until 25 or 30. They cannot make those decisions. And it's really about understanding what you need from prefrontal cortex to make those type of decisions. And the work is really showing that even early in adolescence, given the correct circumstance, you can make those type of decisions. And what is actually changing is the fact that you have ready access to that high-level decision-making in a sustained fashion. But with a young adolescent or mid-adolescent, if you get them in a room with someone who respects the fact that they have their own opinions and so forth, without distractions, and several different meetings and so forth, to really establish that they're using that part of the brain, they can make really important decisions about their life.
So it's just giving them the time to access that properly. So they are quite capable of it, but you need to understand they just need the time to do it properly rather than
in the right environment.
Yeah. Okay. Whereas an adult can kind of see through and
they
decide
can
very
readily
quickly.
access. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So talking of health, when it comes to mental health, there's a lot of mental health conditions that appear in adolescents, like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. How does your research help us understand what happens in this period and why these things emerge at that time?
That is the biggest reason for what we do. Mm-hmm. And that's why the National Institutes of Mental Health have been supporting our work for more than 20 years. Mm-hmm. What is going on that when you go from, that deceleration, that plasticity sort of a thing, to the emergence of psychopathology? And that's why it's important for us to understand what are the specific mechanisms. What is dopamine doing? Dopamine is involved in many of those psychopathologies. Bipolar, all kinds of mood disorders, schizophrenia, depression, and it's involved in everything. And the fact that it's going through these unique changes in adolescence is very important to understand for interventions, being behavioral or even pharmacological ones. The one thing that I really make a big point of is that the way that with all my years in the field, the way that I've been looking at mental illness and psychopathology is that it's not necessarily that something broke in the brain. You were born with a neurobiological genetic predisposition into an environment. The brain doesn't know what society or what the DSM-5, whatever we're at, has decided is a mental disorder. It just says, okay, you've got these genetics, you've got this environment, these are the circuitry that you're using. You use this a lot. We're going to myelinate this, and this is who you're going to be, right? So if you have a predisposition for depression and you're in an environment where you're constantly having these experiences and using that emotional circuitry involving the amygdala, the brain doesn't know that it's not going to be accepted in society and that's going to cause grief. It just says, all right, so now when that happens in adolescence and you're going to determine trajectories, that brain is going to say, okay, you're going to have a high, a predominance of using that circuitry, which leads to high risk for depression, for example.
So just to clarify, when you say myelination, that's the process of where the axons get covered in myelin, which is kind of a fatty substance. And what that does is increases the speed of connection with certain areas, right? So when you myelinate a certain area, you're going to get, basically if an area is going to be used more, it's going to get myelinated because that's going to need a faster connection and more high speed kind of traffic in that area, basically.
Yes. So it speeds, it protects from signal loss.
Yeah.
But importantly for plasticity, it is a closing factor. It says you cannot change as much anymore. Although there are processes that fascinate me of being able to decrease that myelination for learning purposes. And this is work that's been done at the NICHD and other places with rodent models, where in learning you have it's like, I think of it as Spider-Man, like an astrocyte comes and goes, okay, myelinate this, because you're learning this. But this other one clips some of that myelin out to slow it down. So there's a lot of plasticity that will persist throughout the lifespan. But that major myelination, you're correct.
So when you have disorders that emerge earlier in life, like in children, like ADHD or autism, do those change during the teen years? Is there any impact of adolescence on those? So
I've studied both of these conditions earlier in my career. And for example, with autism, which for me was very compelling, we looked at high functioning autistic individuals, a lot of them with Asperger's and so forth. And I should say individuals who have been diagnosed with autism. And surprisingly, what we found, yes, their cognitive performances was lower than their, more typically developing counterparts. But the rate of change through development was the same. So even though they were always low, they were still showing the same degree of improvement through this period of adolescence. And that's always been very compelling to me, because it's saying there are some aspects that are very different to these brains, but the brain maturational processes, which are so big, are available. And what we're talking about is a period of plasticity, right? So that you can actually influence the trajectories of different, predispositions.
But is there any difference in that dual model that you had with the emotional systems and the cognitive systems? Are they the same and working in the same way as they are in neurotypical adolescence, where you've got the slowdown of the cognitive system and the reward emotion system kind of speeding up?
That's part of our more longer term aim. What we really want to crack down, and I've actually talked about this at other times, and I didn't have time yesterday to talk about it, but when you take your child to the pediatrician and they say, how tall are you? And, oh, look, you're 70th percentile. Okay. I mean, if you were very low, it'd be like, oh, shoot, let's see what's going on. I think, and I've been talking about this, and I think some people are doing it, and I should find time to do it. We need to have a neurocognitive growth chart, because we know that in all of the psychopathologies, from autism, ADHD, schizophrenia, depression, cognition is always affected. Not that it characterizes that disorder, but it is, for me, it's a sign of the way the readiness for complex networks to function together, there's something different here, because we can see it in cognition. And if we were able to catch this in a pediatric growth chart of cognition with maybe some very simple but very well characterized cognitive tasks, maybe you could start to see, oh, wait a minute, this child is falling off the normative range. Maybe we need to look at this a little bit more, and then develop sort of interventions that might be helping to bring them back.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because we tend to only look at cognition in the doctor's office when you're over 65 or something. It's completely ignored before that. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we definitely need to look at that.
So what about things like addiction? How does a developing brain respond differently to substances or habits compared to adults?
It's a very, very hot topic. So I participate in two big studies. One is the NCANDA study that has to do with alcohol during adolescence. And it was the precursor for the now pretty famous ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. Both of them very much motivated by substance use, etc. So there are a couple of things, the reason that we need these sort of longitudinal studies is that it's been very difficult to try to understand possible causal associations, right? What came first? Problems in working memory were caused by cannabis, or problems in working memory had to do with the use of cannabis. And we've actually, showed in earlier studies that there is a predisposition, that might be very separate from possible what we call teratogenic causes of the substances. And I know, in principle, people are like, oh my God, they're being exposed to all these things and in a time of plasticity. But we really have to suspend our beliefs and be very scientific about it and rigorous and saying, well, what would be the mechanisms, right? What are we actually concerned about? We know that a lot of teenagers are going to experiment with substances. I did, and here I am in a podcast, I think one of the biggest concerns is, will it become habitual? And even though a lot of adolescents, right, because of peers and blah, 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 and the dopamine sort of a thing, will experiment, in a very small proportion will end up with what's called a substance use disorder. And then we start thinking about addiction. And then we start to think about habits. And we've been studying habits, which curiously have really not been studied in humans in adolescence. It has been in rodents. And what they have been finding is that it's hard for juveniles, for adolescents to form habits. And that's because a habit, by definition, is a behavior that you continue to do persistently even after the reward is gone. It's a beautiful process that we have. It allows us, here you guys are driving all the time, to be thinking of something else while you're driving home, blah, blah, blah. You have all these really good habits, you brush your teeth, etc. But with adolescents, it's difficult for them because they're so reward-driven that if you take that reward out, it's hard for them to persist with that behavior. And so with adults, they're so quick, the system is so efficient that you get that association, after some few trials, you're like, okay, this is a behavior that I'm going to automatize. And I don't have to think about it anymore. And unfortunately, that can happen with substance use. But it will happen later. You do see substance use disorders in adolescents, right? So there's, again, variability in that respect as well. But that's what we're trying to understand. And we have some new work that's very interesting that, again, has to do with different trajectories in the dampening of the influence of affect and emotion and of the habit circuitry that is supposed to, dampen and may not be dampening with those who have persistent use.
So your work has informed U.S. policy on things like juvenile sentencing, teen pregnancy, and age limits for drinking and driving. So can you tell us more about how your research has influenced these policies?
I've only worked directly in 2 American Medical Association briefs that were presented to the U.S. Supreme Court that dealt with life without parole for a juvenile. First, it was for non-homicide, and then it was for homicide. Previous to that, you're also young, but the United States was one of the few places in the world who had the death penalty for juveniles. One of the only places in the world. And at that time, the American Medical Association, we're talking like 2005, it was a long time. Oh. Yeah. And they referenced a lot of my work. So then when the Life Without Parole came, they started to ask me to help with these briefs. And it was a very important part of my career because it was like, can we really translate, what we do in the lab and, for other purposes to something that's going to have a really big impact. So I took a very long time and very deep thinking and talking to the top developmental cognitive neuroscience about how could we inform. And for example, for the Life Without Parole, there were some very important points. Number one, which I talked about before, we don't know, based on that one act, who this individual is going to be, right? So a life without parole would go with what the main argument was, which is cruel and unusual punishment. And the other aspect of it is that this is a period of high plasticity. So they're more amenable to rehabilitation. So the implications are not like, oh, they're just silly adolescents, let them go. No, no, no. It'd be great to be able to catch serial killers, before letting them go. But the thing is that life without parole, without examining that, would not go with the science, right? So it would be more like, let's re-examine how this individual's trajectory is coming when they become adults, 20s or 30s. Have they become someone that could really contribute to society or not?
So how old is old enough to be held accountable for their actions? Like, how do we determine they are now past that adolescent stage and can now be tried as adults?
That is an ethical question. What I can inform based on our brain studies and behavior, especially that one paper in Nature Communications by Brendan Turvo Clemens, is that 18 on average, there seems to start to be access to adult level cognition, which would influence decision making. That is going to be variable. A lot of crimes are committed by individuals who were born with adversity, with trauma, with high stress, with uncertainty in neighborhoods and in parenting, and that has been shown to influence the timing of plasticity. So there's a lot of nuances that would go into determining, at the individual level, and I deal at the group level. At the individual level, there would be a lot of variables that could influence when adult level decision making would come online.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to that cognitive growth chart that you mentioned, that might complain useful for situations like this to determine how is their trajectory from young age to now, how is their development, what stage are they at, and maybe that can help us more easily make that decision.
Yes, absolutely.
So hormones are a big part of teen years, but they don't always get discussed in terms of brain development. So what role do they play in shaping sex differences in adolescent brain development and behavior?
I mean, that has been a very, very complex question. We've been trying to answer it. Many others have been trying to answer it. And it's at least for me, we're not at the level where we can be very conclusive. We know that there's different trajectories, right? There's testosterone, there's estrogen, progesterone, and both of them. And puberty has different timing for males and females, and the brain is full of receptors that are responsive to these different hormones that could really affect the timing of trajectories and what becomes predominant. And we know that because puberty changes depending on different environmental factors, and that would, engage the brain as well. So there's a lot to learn there. There are some things that we know, which is really amazing, is white matter in the brain is developing sooner in females. I feel very confident because many people have had that finding. One really interesting one that we found that we wrote a review paper about, we looked at the literature, this was years ago, on high stress situations and reactivity of the sympathetic system. And so, for example, all these like high stress laboratory studies where it's like, oh, you have to do an impossible math test, or you have to do a speech, like really heightening, the stress that is being felt. And then taking blood pressure and pulse. And what was really interesting is that looking at all this stuff, that predominantly it seemed like males, their blood pressure would go up very high, but not females. Okay, so the interesting part is that predominantly when you asked males, what did you think of this? Oh, it's fine. and females were like, oh my God, that was so stressful. That really led us to believe that early maturation of the white matter provides early connectivity in females to be able to have more ready control of sympathetic reactivity, so that you have that concept, okay, this is stressful, and that allows you to not have your blood pressure go up high because you are already in recognition of that.
I mean, that kind of fits with, what we see in society. We typically see girls, it feels like girls mature more quickly than boys in the adolescent years.
Oh my God,
that
yes.
Kind of shows the neurobiological basis for that.
That makes me mad about the in historical times, how women and teen girls were labeled as hysterical and having these like nervous breakdown issues. And it's like, well, now we have the science to show we can actually maybe control it better.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And so just going back on your comment you made about habits earlier. So I have teens and I'm just thinking, is what you're saying that I need to tell them every single day when I want to do stuff? Or do things ever become a habit, like telling them to clean their room and stuff like that? Like, when do those things click?
That's what we're trying to find out. Like I said, no one has really looked at this before. And obviously there's going to be variability. There's going to be different levels of demands that, that the brain is going to decide, okay, I'm going to make this into a habit. And yeah, I remember having teens and, brush your freaking teeth.
Every day. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your perspective on the teen brain. Where can our listeners learn more about your work?
They can look me up, Beatriz, Beatriz Luna. If you just put Luna, you will get a lot of cute puppies. He calls them Luna. But if you put Beatriz Luna and the brain,
okay, great.
You'll find a lot of things.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You ladies asked all the right questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Neurologic, the CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others.
This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran, our marketing and operations producer, and Pan Gu, our audio-video producer and editor.
To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu. And here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan.
Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.